So they had to go back and use what the Romans developed 2,000 years ago for building tunnels under city streets, which is the cut and cover method. The cut and cover method is actually the opposite of building a tunnel, because first you start off by digging out an open trench, then you put the walls in, then you put the roof on top, and then you fill it on top of the roof of the tunnel and level it off to grade level outside with the rest of the street. So that's the cut and cover process in a nutshell, but I'll get into that more in a minute. Now, the tunnel was designed by an engineer named David Bates Douglas, and he was also the same person who designed the first Croton Aqueduct, and he also designed the High Bridge that goes across from Manhattan to the Bronx for the aqueduct system, and he also designed Greenwood Cemetery. So he was a very accomplished engineer, but he had trouble getting along with people, so he never really got the credit that he's supposed to get. Now, the contractor was named William Beard, and he had experience building cut and cover tunnels for the Croton Aqueduct system 2 years earlier in 1842. So Beard and Douglas knew each other because they both worked on the Croton Aqueduct system. So to get the design for this tunnel, what they basically did was take the plans for the Croton Aqueduct, which were in turn copied off of the Emperor Claudius's aqueduct from 2,000 years ago, and multiplied all dimensions by 2.6. And that gave them a tunnel that had enough open span inside of it to accommodate 2 railroad trains to pass each other side by side, and also accommodate the very tall smokestacks the engines used to have. So that's where the design of the tunnel came from. It's based on, so the world's first subway tunnel is based on an aqueduct tunnel from 2,000 years ago, but it's adapted to railroad use, which is what engineering is all about. You know, engineering and science do not happen in a vacuum. Neither does history. Things don't just spring up out of nowhere. They're built upon and improved upon, and you can always trace something back to its beginnings and see how it developed over the years. So that's how the plan for the tunnel was developed. Now, to get permission to build this tunnel, they had to go to the city of Brooklyn. And the city of Brooklyn was all gung-ho about doing it because they wanted the people who live in the area off their backs who were complaining about the trains being in the street. So the railroad company went to a secret session of the Brooklyn City Council. Now, back then, they openly wrote in the newspaper, "Tonight there will be a secret session of the city council." So they had, they advertised they were having the session, but you couldn't go in because it's a secret and there were no minutes taken. So they went into a closed session and they carried with them a bag full of railroad stock and money, and they came out a little while later with the franchise for this tunnel. So the franchise said they had 4 months to build it, because originally it was supposed to be a 1-track tunnel. Somewhere along the line it got changed to a 2-track tunnel. So when the 4 months was running out, the railroad got very panicky because they figured their time period was expiring and the city might shut them down. So they went and hired an overseer who was English. Now, the workers who built this tunnel were mostly Irish, and there were 800 of them. So this English overseer went down to tell the 800 Irishmen that they had to work on Sundays to make the project go faster. Now, that was a big no-no because Sundays was their Sabbath day. And then on top of that, he says, "Oh, by the way, we don't have any extra money to pay you for working on it Sunday, so you're just going to come down and volunteer and be nice guys. And by the way, if you don't like this, you're all fired because there's more of you coming off the boat every day and we'll just replace you all." So at this point, one of the sandhogs didn't like the way these labor negotiations were going, and he pulled a Derringer out of his boot, shot the overseer in the head, and the other sandhogs chopped him up, and according to the newspaper report, he should be right behind that stone wall. So if you see a green ball of light floating around, it's just the overseer looking for his head. Now, this is all written up in the newspaper in the Long Island Star, so it has to be real, right? Now, to put credit where credit's due, when the rest of New York City's subway system was built in the late 1890s and early 1900s, it was largely built by Italians and by African Americans. So all the people in the main migration waves all took a hand in building New York City's infrastructure. So the tunnel got built in 7 months, which was a huge accomplishment to build a tunnel like this in just 7 months. Now, you have to keep in mind there was no environmental or land use review back then, and when they dug out the earth to make the trench in the street, they were allowed to take the dirt and just dump it into the harbor to make more real estate. Back then, they liked it when you dump stuff in the water to make more real estate. So they were able to get this tunnel done very quickly, even though they didn't have excavating machines or hydraulic machines or pneumatic machines. The only kind of machines these guys had back then was levers, pulleys, and screw jacks, and horses and mules, and that was it. So what they did in 7 months is really incredible, because if they went to build a tunnel like this today, it would take them 7 years just to get the environmental approvals, if ever. And then to build it, who knows how many decades that would take. Look at the one on 2nd Avenue, how long that's been taking. So back then, they did things quick, even though they didn't have machinery. Now, when the rest of the New York City subway system was built in the early 1900s, they didn't use stone or brick anymore. And the reason for that was because labor had become too expensive, and the cost for building this kind of tunnel became prohibitive. So instead, they used steel and reinforced concrete, which lended itself to automated processes of pouring concrete and erecting steel work. So that's why the type of material shifted over around 1900, because this type of tunnel became too expensive to build because of the labor involved. Now, I just finished telling you how there was no rock in Brooklyn. So where'd this rock come from in the wall? The rock is 6.5 feet thick at the base, 4.5 feet thick at the spring line, which is where the brick begins. Then the brick roof is 4.5 feet thick, and it tapers to 2 feet thick at the center, which is called the crown. The answer is all this rock came from Manhattan. At the same time William Beard was building this tunnel, he had contracts to build 3rd Avenue and Broadway in Manhattan. And unlike Brooklyn, Manhattan had mountains on it millions of years ago. So when he got into the area around the UN building in Harlem, there were natural outcroppings of rock. So he cut the stuff up by hand. They didn't have diamond saws back then. They cut it up by hand using wedges and shims and 5-foot drill bits and stuff like that. And they put the rock onto barges and sent it into the project and just fed it all in. So all this stone came from Manhattan. All the brick, there's about 8 million bricks in the roof of the tunnel, probably came from the area up around Haverstraw, New York on the Hudson River, because that's where they used to manufacture a lot of brick in those days. And it was probably also moved by barge down the Hudson River and then into this project. So that's how the tunnel got built. Now, what we're going to do is go back and talk a little bit about how it got closed up and what went wrong with it. But before I do that, let me just give you a little bit of an elaboration on exactly how the tunnel was constructed. First, they dug out the trench, which was 33 feet wide. Then they put the walls in. After the walls were put in, they put 2 tracks in. On top of the 2 tracks came 2 flat cars bolted together side by side, and on top of the flat cars was a 50-foot long wooden form called a barrel vault form. That's where this type of tunnel roof gets its name from. It's called a barrel vault because the wooden form that's used to erect it looks like a giant beer barrel that's slit in half and laid flat. So they lifted up this wooden form with screw jacks, and the wooden form was built out of timbers like 18 inches thick that could take the dead weight of all the brick laying on top of it while the cement and the joints dried up. So they would take this form, lift it up into position, and lay brick on it from one wall across to the other wall and go back and forth until they built up the thickness of roof they wanted. Then they let the cement in the roof harden a little bit, lowered the screw jack, moved the railroad cars up 50 feet, lifted the form up again, repeated the whole process. So even though we have a tunnel roof which is 2,000 feet long of homogeneous brick, it was built in 50 feet ring segments at a time. And also, they did not build this tunnel from one end to the other end. Whenever you build a tunnel, you never start from one side and go to the other end, because that's building it stupid. What you have to do is subdivide it up into sections and build it in sections, and that cuts down the work time. So, for example, what they did with this tunnel was at the geographical center of the structure, they dug a vertical shaft from the street down to track level. Then they had one crew work to the east and one crew work to the west simultaneously, and that's how they were able to belt it out in just 7 months.